The river swallowed sound the way old wounds swallow light, completely, without mercy, without memory. Marcus Chen had been driving the night route for 3 years now, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., navigating the serpentine roads that wound through the old estates on the city's forgotten edge. The delivery app glowed on his dashboard, a cold blue star guiding him through neighborhoods where streetlights grew sparse and houses retreated behind iron gates and centuries-old oaks. He preferred this shift. The loneliness of it matched something inside him that daylight made too visible. Tonight, the fog had rolled in from the marshlands, thick as gauze over a wound. His headlights carved temporary tunnels through the gray, revealing nothing beyond their reach but suggestion and shadow. The GPS instructed him to turn left in 500 feet, toward an address he'd never delivered to before, some sprawling property called Ashworth Manor that appeared on no map he'd ever consulted. The delivery was simple enough. 2 bottles of rare wine from an antiquarian shop downtown. The order had come through at 10:47, with a note typed in formal language. Please leave at the river gate. Do not ring. Payment has been arranged. But the river gate, when Marcus found it, stood open. He parked on the gravel shoulder and stepped out, the wine cradled against his chest. The fog tasted of wet stone and something older, iron perhaps, or the particular sweetness of decay that haunted places where time moved differently. Through the gate, a path descended toward the sound of water. The river, he knew, ran along the eastern boundary of these estates, though he had never seen it this close. It was said to be deep here and fast, fed by underground springs that kept it cold even in summer. The path curved, and Marcus stopped. A figure stood at the river's edge, small and still, silhouetted against the fog-shrouded water. A child, he realized with a start. A boy, no more than 8 or 9, dressed in clothes that seemed wrong for the season. A velvet jacket, shoes that gleamed even in the dim light. He stood on a rock that jutted over the current, his arms spread as if he meant to embrace the darkness. Marcus didn't think. His feet were moving before his mind could calculate distance or consequence. The wine bottles fell to the muddy bank. His voice tore through the silence. A single word. Hey, that seemed to startle the fog itself. The boy turned. His face was pale as bone china, his eyes dark wells that reflected no light. And then he slipped. The splash was almost gentle, a whisper of displacement that belied the violence of the river's grip. Marcus ran. He shed his jacket without breaking stride, his body remembering the summers he'd spent at his grandmother's lake house, the countless hours he'd spent cutting through water that felt like a second home. The river was nothing like that lake. It was cold enough to steal breath, dark enough to steal direction, but he dove anyway. The current seized him immediately, dragging him downstream, with a force that spoke of depths he couldn't see. He kicked hard, arms sweeping through water that felt thick as oil. Something pale flickered below him, a hand reaching upward, and he drove himself down, lungs already burning, fingers closing around fabric that tore but held. The boy was light, too light, as if his bones were hollow, as if he were made of something other than flesh and blood. Marcus pulled him close and kicked toward what he prayed was the surface, toward the faint suggestion of light that might have been fog or might have been nothing at all. They broke through together, gasping, though Marcus noticed, even in his desperation, that the boy didn't gasp quite right. His mouth opened, his chest moved, but there was a quality to it that seemed performed rather than necessary. The bank was mud and tangled roots, but Marcus hauled them both onto it, his body shaking with cold that went deeper than the river had any right to reach. The boy lay beside him, utterly still, those dark eyes fixed on Marcus's face with an intensity that felt centuries old. "You're safe," Marcus managed, his voice rough with river water. "You're okay. I've got you." The boy said nothing, but his hand, small and ice-cold, found Marcus's wrist and held it with surprising strength. That was when Marcus heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching from the direction of the manor with a rhythm that suggested someone who had never learned to hurry because time had ceased to matter to them long ago. A man emerged from the fog, tall and angular, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the limited light rather than reflect it. His face was carved from the same pale stone as the boy's, his features sharp enough to cut, his eyes, when they met Marcus's, the color of old amber, holding depths that no human gaze should possess. "You touch my son," the man said. His voice was soft, cultured, carrying an accent that Marcus couldn't place, something European, but filtered through centuries of wandering. "You pulled him from the water." Marcus struggled to sit up, suddenly aware of how vulnerable he was. soaked, shivering, alone in the dark with strangers who moved wrong and spoke wrong and looked at him as if he were something they had never encountered before. "He fell," Marcus said. "He was on the rocks. He fell." The man's gaze shifted to the boy, who had risen to his feet without Marcus noticing. Water dripped from the child's velvet jacket, from his fine dark hair, but he showed no sign of cold, no shivering, no chattering teeth. He stood perfectly still, watching his father with an expression that might have been guilt or might have been something far more complicated. "Sebastian," the man said. Just the name, but it carried the weight of questions that would be asked later, in private, with consequences Marcus couldn't imagine. The boy, Sebastian, lowered his eyes. "I wanted to see the fisherman's fire," he whispered. "On the other bank. I thought I could cross." "We do not cross running water." The man's voice remained soft, but something in it made Marcus's skin prickle. "You know this. You have always known this." The boy nodded, a single dip of his chin that seemed to contain centuries of obedience. Then the man turned back to Marcus, and something shifted in those amber eyes. The hardness gave way to something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of something that might, in time, become gratitude. "You risked yourself," the man said, "for a child you did not know, in water that should have killed you." Marcus shrugged, though the motion made his exhausted muscles scream. He was drowning, wasn't going to stand there and watch. The man studied him for a long moment, his gaze traveling over Marcus's face, as if reading a language written there that Marcus himself couldn't see. "What is your name? Deliverer of wine and rescuer of princes." "Marcus Chen." "Marcus Chen." The man tasted the syllables as if they were something to be savored. "I am Aldrich Ashworth, and I find myself in your debt." He extended a hand. Marcus took it without thinking and nearly pulled away at the touch. The man's skin was cold, not cool, not chilled, but cold in the way of things that had never known warmth. Cold in the way of deep cellars and ancient tombs and places where the sun's light had never reached. But Marcus held on. Something in him, the same something that had driven him into the river, refused to flinch. "You're freezing," Aldrich said, and the observation seemed to amuse him in some private way. "Both of you are. Come." He released Marcus's hand and turned toward the path. "The manor is warm. You will dry yourself there, and we will speak of debts." Marcus should have refused. Every instinct honed by 3 years of late-night deliveries in these dangerous neighborhoods told him to get back in his car and drive away from this place where the fog clung too close and the people moved too quietly, and a child could fall into a river without struggling for breath. But Sebastian had moved to stand beside him, and the boy's small hand found his again, gripping with that strange cold strength. "Please," Sebastian whispered, "come with us. Father never lets anyone come." And Marcus, who had spent 28 years learning to trust his instincts, found himself following the strange man and his stranger son up the winding path, toward the manor that grew out of the fog like something dreamed rather than built. The gates of Ashworth Manor stood 15 feet tall, wrought iron twisted into patterns that seemed to shift when Marcus looked at them directly. Wolves and ravens and thorned roses, all intertwined in a dance that predated any artistic movement he could name. The manor beyond was vast, a sprawl of Gothic architecture that had accumulated over what must have been centuries. Towers and wings and additions. That spoke of different eras, different tastes, all unified by the same weathered gray stone. No lights burned in the windows. Yet, when Aldrich pressed his palm to the great oak door, it swung inward to reveal warmth and illumination that seemed to have no source. The entrance hall was cavernous, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls lined with portraits that watched Marcus pass with painted eyes that seemed too alive. A fire roared in a fireplace large enough to stand in, and before it, a chair had been drawn close. The kind of chair that belonged in museums, upholstered in fabric that had probably been woven before Marcus's country existed. "Sit," Aldrich said. It was not a request. Marcus sat. The heat from the fire was immediate, penetrating, working its way through his soaked clothes and into bones that had begun to feel permanently cold. Sebastian had vanished somewhere between the door and this room, dismissed by his father with a glance, sent to wherever children in this strange house went when adults had business to discuss. Aldrich remained standing, a shadow against the firelight, his features rendered stark and strange by the dancing flames. "You are wondering what we are," he said. Marcus considered lying, considered playing the fool, pretending he hadn't noticed the cold skin, the hollow breathing, the way father and son moved through the fog as if they were part of it. but something in Aldrich's gaze told him that deception would be both futile and unwise. "I have some guesses," Marcus admitted. "I imagine you do." Aldrich moved to a side table where crystal decanters caught the firelight. He poured something dark and amber into 2 glasses, brought one to Marcus. "Drink. It will warm you faster than the fire." The liquid burned pleasantly, tasting of smoke and honey, and something else Marcus couldn't identify. Something old. Something that had no business existing in the same world as delivery apps and GPS navigation. "My kind have many names," Aldrich said, settling into a chair across from Marcus. "Most of them wrong, most of them born from fear and misunderstanding. We are not demons. We are not damned souls awaiting judgment. We are simply other. Older than the stories told about us. Older, perhaps, than the species that tells them." "Vampires?" Marcus said the word flatly without inflection. It still sounded absurd, spoken aloud in the 21st century. "If you like." Aldrich took a slow sip from his glass. "The word is crude, but serviceable. We drink blood, yes. We do not age. Sunlight weakens us, though it does not destroy as your films suggest. Running water." He paused, and something flickered across his ancient face. Pain, perhaps. Old fear. "Running water is more dangerous than any stake or crucifix. It disrupts what we are at a fundamental level. We cannot cross it without great preparation and greater cost. To fall into it, to be submerged." He trailed off, his gaze moving to the fire. "Sebastian is young, barely 70 years, which among us is childhood still. He does not yet understand what the river might have done to him. But I pulled him out." Marcus leaned forward, the glass forgotten in his hands. "He's fine. He is fine because you reached him in time. Another minute, perhaps less, and the water would have begun to unmake him, to dissolve the bonds that hold his form together." Aldrich's eyes found Marcus's again. "You saved my son from a death that would have been permanent. True death. The end that even we cannot escape." The weight of that settled over Marcus like a physical thing. He had saved a life that was not quite life as he understood it, but life nonetheless. A child who had been curious about a fire on the far bank, who had made a mistake that children make, whose father now sat across from Marcus with something raw and barely contained behind his ancient composure. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Why bring me here, show me your home, explain what you are? Most people in your position would want to keep their secrets, would probably want to—" He didn't finish the sentence. "Want to silence you?" Aldrich's lips curved, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "I could. It would be simple enough. You are mortal, alone, and no one knows where you are." He let that truth hang in the air for a moment. "But I will not. For 2 reasons. He set down his glass and rose, moving to the fireplace, his back to Marcus. "First, because you saved Sebastian, and while I have done many things in my centuries of existence, some of them terrible beyond your imagining, I have never been one to repay kindness with cruelty. Debt is sacred among my kind, more sacred perhaps than among yours. You have placed yourself in my debt by entering my home, but I have placed myself in yours by virtue of what you did at the river. These debts do not cancel, they compound." He turned, and the firelight made his features dance between human and something else entirely. "Second, because I have watched you, Marcus Chen. Not tonight, before tonight. For 3 years, you have driven these roads in the dark hours, and for 3 years, I have observed how you move through the world. You are alone in a way that most mortals cannot sustain. You seek solitude not as escape, but as sanctuary. You are drawn to the edges of things, the margins where light fails and certainty fades." He tilted his head, studying Marcus with that predatory patience. "You are, in short, not unlike us, and that makes you valuable in ways you do not yet understand." Marcus's heart was beating too fast. He could feel it pounding against his ribs, could hear it thundering in his ears, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that Aldrich could hear it too. "Valuable how?" "I would offer you a position," Aldrich said. "Not servitude. I do not keep slaves, and I do not accept the broken. I would offer you employment here at the manor as a liaison, let us say, a bridge between my household and the mortal world that moves beyond our gates. There are things we cannot do for ourselves in the daylight hours, matters that require human hands and human faces and human warmth. You want me to work for you. I want you to work with me. There is a difference." Aldrich returned to his chair, sinking into it with a weariness that seemed to span ages. "You would be compensated handsomely. You would have protection, both from my kind and from the darker things that prey upon mortals who stumble into our world. and you would have access to knowledge that most of your species cannot imagine. And if I refuse? Then you walk out that door with your memory intact and your life unchanged, and you return to your delivery routes and your solitary apartment and your slow fade into middle age. I would be disappointed, but I would not compel you. That is not the foundation on which I wish to build this particular bridge. Marcus looked around the hall, at the portraits with their two living eyes, at the fire that burned without consuming fuel, at the shadows that gathered in corners as if they had weight and intention. He thought about his apartment, 3 rooms of nothing particular in a building full of people he never spoke to. He thought about the delivery app, its cold blue glow, the endless rotation of addresses and orders, and nights that bled into nights without distinction. And he thought about the boy, Sebastian, 70 years old and still learning, still making the mistakes of childhood, still capable of being saved by a stranger in the dark. I want to meet the rest of your household, Marcus said finally, before I decide anything. Aldrich's smile, when it came, was genuine and terrifying in its beauty. Of course, he said. Let me show you what we are. The days that followed were education disguised as employment, initiation presented as orientation. The household of Ashworth Manor numbered 12, 11 vampires, some as old as Aldrich himself, others turned more recently. Though recently meant different things here. The youngest, aside from Sebastian, had been turned in 1952, a jazz musician from New Orleans who had wandered too close to the wrong kind of hunger. The oldest was a woman named Constance, who claimed to have watched the Roman legions march, and whose eyes held depths that made even Aldrich seem young. Marcus learned their customs. The hierarchy was complex, built on age and power, and debts accumulated over centuries. Aldrich sat at its apex not merely by force, but by consent. He was the one who had gathered them, who had offered them sanctuary in an age when their kind were hunted, who had established the rules that allowed them to exist in proximity to the human world without drawing its attention or its fire. The rules were strict. No hunting within 100 miles of the manor. Blood was acquired through arrangements with hospitals and blood banks, paid for at rates that kept questions unasked. No turning without Aldrich's permission, a rule that had been broken exactly once, with consequences Marcus chose not to imagine. And above all, secrecy. Absolute, inviolable secrecy. We survived the witch trials and the plagues and the world wars. Aldrich explained one evening as Marcus catalogued the contents of a cellar that held wine older than most nations. We did not survive by force. We survived by invisibility, by being story rather than fact, by letting them believe we were myth. Marcus became, as Aldrich had suggested, a bridge. He handled the daylight tasks that the household could not. Meetings with lawyers and bankers, negotiations with suppliers, the endless administrative weight of maintaining properties and investments that spanned continents. He learned that Aldrich's wealth was vast in ways that defied mortal comprehension, accumulated over 800 years of careful cultivation and patient waiting. But his true role, he discovered, was simpler. He was human presence. He was warmth. Sebastian had attached himself to Marcus with the determination of a child who had found something rare and did not intend to release it. The boy had been starving, Marcus realized, not for blood, but for mortality. For someone who aged, for someone whose heart beat and whose skin warmed and whose eyes reflected light in the ordinary way. For someone who could sit with him in the garden at dusk and not flinch when Sebastian's nature slipped through the cracks of his careful control. My mother was human, Sebastian told him one evening as they sat by the river gate, the same rocks, though Sebastian no longer approached the water's edge. Father loved her. He does not speak of it, but I know. What happened to her? She grew old. Sebastian's voice was flat, as if he were recounting something that had happened to someone else. Father offered her the turning many times. She refused. She said she wanted to die knowing what she was. He paused. I was 7 when she passed. She looked like my grandmother by then, like a stranger wearing my mother's face. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. I remember what it felt like, Sebastian continued. Watching her age. Every day something changed. Her hair, her hands, the way she moved. And I stayed the same. I was frozen while she dissolved. He looked at Marcus, and in his young face Marcus saw the weight of decades he should not have had to carry. That is what immortality is, Marcus. It is not endless life. It is endless watching, endless losing, endless staying while everything around you goes. Your father has watched so many die that he has learned to count time and loss. Centuries of it. Wars and plagues and ordinary deaths. Everyone he has ever cared for who was not like us. Sebastian turned back to the river, watching it rush past with something that might have been hatred. He says the pain grows less. He is lying. I have seen him. In the dark hours, when he thinks no one watches, the pain does not grow less. It simply spreads thinner, a wound stretched over centuries until it covers everything. Marcus thought of his own loneliness, 3 years of night roots and empty apartments, self-imposed exile from a world that had never quite felt like home. It was nothing, a heartbeat, a single grain of sand compared to the desert that Sebastian was describing. Why are you telling me this? Because you saved me. Sebastian's hand found Marcus's wrist again, that cold grip that had become familiar. And I want you to know what that means. Not just my life, but what my life is, what it will be, forever. His dark eyes held Marcus's with an intensity that belonged to someone far older than his face suggested. I want you to know before you decide. Decide what? Whether you will stay, whether you will let us keep you. Sebastian's grip tightened. Father has not offered anyone what he offered you since the century before last. He thinks you do not notice how he watches you, how he counts your heartbeats, how he leans toward your warmth when you stand near him. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. He is lonely, Marcus. We all are. But him most of all. And you? He trailed off, something vulnerable flickering across his ancient child face. You feel like coming home. The threat arrived on a night of particular darkness, when the moon hid behind clouds and the manor seemed to draw in on itself like a creature preparing for danger. Marcus had been with the household for 3 months, long enough to know their rhythms, their histories, their carefully maintained peace, long enough to feel the shift in the air when something disrupted that peace. They came from the east, 5 vampires of a bloodline that Aldrich had warred with in centuries past. A conflict that Marcus gathered had been settled through treaty and territorial agreement. But treaties, it seemed, could be broken. And the eldest of the visitors, a creature named Valerius, who looked barely older than Marcus, but whose eyes held the madness of millennia, had come to collect an old debt. The boy, Valerius said, standing in the entrance hall where Marcus had sat that first night. His followers flanked him like wolves, their hunger barely leashed. You killed my fledgling Aldrich in the siege of Prague, 1648, a child I had created and cherished for 3 centuries before your sword found his heart. He was feasting on children. Aldrich's voice was ice and stone. He was exposing us all with his carelessness. He was mine. The word echoed through the hall, and Marcus felt it in his bones, a pressure, a wrongness, the sense of something ancient and terrible straining against its bonds. And now I will take yours. The terms of our treaty allow it. Blood for blood, child for child. Sebastian stood behind his father, perfectly still, his young face showing no fear. But Marcus could see the tremor in his hands, the way his dark eyes kept flicking toward the doors as if calculating escape routes that did not exist. The treaty specified voluntary exchange, Aldrich said. A child for a child, yes, but only if both parties consent. Consent can be manufactured. Valerius smiled, revealing fangs that seemed longer than Aldrich's, more prominent. Persuasion is an art I have perfected over the ages. You will not touch my son. Then offer me something of equal value. Valerius's mad eyes swept the hall, passing over the other vampires of the household, dismissing them. They landed on Marcus, and something sparked in their depths. The mortal. He carries your mark. I can smell it on him. Your protection, your claim. He matters to you. Marcus felt the attention of the room shift toward him, felt Aldrich's sudden stillness, a stillness that spoke of barely leashed violence. He is not mine to offer, Aldrich said carefully. Then let him offer himself. Valerius moved closer, and Marcus forced himself not to step back. What do you say, warm one? Will you trade your life for the boy's, your blood for his continued existence? Don't. Sebastian's voice cracked on the word. Marcus, don't. You can't. Quiet, child. The adults are negotiating. Valerius's gaze never left Marcus's face. Well, you saved him once already. Will you save him again? Marcus thought of his mother, who had died slowly in a hospital bed while he held her hand and promised her it would be all right. He thought of his father, who had vanished before Marcus could walk, leaving nothing but a name on a birth certificate and a genetic legacy of dark hair and stubborn silence. He thought of the countless nights he had driven through darkness, alone with his thoughts and the cold blue glow of an app that told him where to go, but never why. He thought of Sebastian's cold hand in his, of Aldrich's ancient eyes, watching him with something that might have been hope, of the weight of debt and the strange gravity of belonging. If I agree, Marcus said slowly, Sebastian goes free, completely, no retribution, no future claims, and the rest of the household remains untouched. Marcus? No. Aldrich's voice was sharp, but Valerius was already nodding, already smiling that terrible smile. Agreed. Your life for the boy's freedom. A generous trade, from my perspective. He extended a hand, claws slightly extended, waiting for Marcus to seal the bargain. But Marcus didn't move to take it. Instead, he looked at Aldrich. Really looked, for what he knew might be the last time. You said debt was sacred among your kind, Marcus said. More sacred than among mine. Is that true? Aldrich's eyes widened slightly. Yes. And Sebastian said you've been counting my heartbeats, leaning toward my warmth, watching me in ways you haven't watched anyone in centuries. Marcus kept his voice steady, though his heart was anything but. Is that true? A long pause, then, barely audible. Yes. Then I'm calling in my debt. Marcus turned back to Valerius, whose smile had begun to falter. Before I give myself to you, I claim the debt that Aldrich Ashworth owes me for saving his son. And my claim is this, that he fights for me, that he uses whatever power he has to protect what's his, Valerius snarled. That's not... It's perfectly legitimate. Constance's voice cut through the hall like a blade. She had not moved from her place by the wall, but her presence suddenly filled the space. He claimed a debt. The claim is valid, and debt, as we all know, is sacred. The ancient vampire turned her gaze on Valerius, and Marcus saw him flinch, saw all of his followers flinch. Whatever Constance was, whatever power she held, it was enough to make even the mad and ancient careful. You can have your duel, Valerius, she continued, blood for blood, but the mortal has invoked the old laws. Aldrich must defend him, and we both know how that contest will end. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Valerius threw back his head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass, like the screams of dying things. Clever, he spat. Your pet is clever, Aldrich. I wonder who taught him to think like one of us. His mad eyes found Marcus again. Very well, keep your mortal, keep your boy. But know this, I have a long memory, longer than any of you, and debts. He smiled. Debts compound. He turned and walked out, his followers trailing behind him like shadows returning to the dark that had spawned them. And in the silence that followed, Marcus's knees finally gave out. Aldrich caught him before he hit the floor. 3 nights later, Marcus stood on the same riverbank where everything had begun. The fog had lifted, and for the first time since his arrival, he could see the water clearly, dark and swift, carrying leaves and branches toward destinations he would never know. Aldrich stood beside him, close enough that Marcus could feel the absence of warmth where warmth should have been. You should have let me make the trade, Marcus said. I should have done nothing of the sort. He would have killed me eventually, tortured me first probably, but Sebastian would have been safe. Sebastian would have been destroyed by the guilt. Aldrich's voice was soft, but certain. He has lost one parent to the slow cruelty of time. Losing a friend to the swift cruelty of violence would have broken something in him that I could not repair. Friend, Marcus turned the word over, testing its weight. Is that what I am? You are what you choose to be. Aldrich turned to face him, and in the starlight, his features seemed less alien, more recognizably human, lonely, uncertain, old in ways that had nothing to do with years. Sebastian loves you. The household has accepted you. Even Constance speaks your name without disdain, which is more than she offers most mortals. And you? The question hung between them, heavy with everything they had not said in 3 months of careful distance and charged silences. I have existed for 800 years, Aldrich said finally. I have loved twice in all that time. The first was a warrior who died in battle before the concept of nations existed. The second was Sebastian's mother, who chose mortality over eternity at my side. He paused, and something cracked in his ancient composure. I told myself I would not love again, that the price was too high, that to care for mortals was to sign a contract of guaranteed grief. But you jumped into a river to save my son. Aldrich's hand found Marcus's, cold fingers intertwining with warm. You faced an ancient monster with nothing but cleverness and courage. You made me remember what it was to feel something other than the weight of years. Marcus looked at their joined hands. At the contrast, his skin dark and warm, Aldrich's pale and cold, living and undead, temporary and eternal. I'm going to die, Marcus said. Eventually. That's not negotiable. I know. And you're asking me to... what? Let you watch me age? Let Sebastian watch me age? Repeat the same grief all over again? Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything but truth. I am asking you to let me love you for whatever time you have, whether that is 50 years or 5, whether you choose to remain mortal, or—" He stopped, visibly steadying himself. "Or choose otherwise. I am asking you to stay, not because I can offer you eternity, not because I can protect you from every threat, but because for the first time in centuries, I want to wake each night knowing you are here. I want to count your heartbeats not as a reminder of loss, but as a gift. Each one, every single one, for however long they last." The river rushed past them, dark and eternal, carrying its secrets toward the sea. Above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of earthbound creatures. And Marcus Chen, delivery driver, orphan, solitary wanderer through the margins of the world, made a choice. He stepped closer. Let his warmth press against Aldrich's cold. Let his hand rise to touch a face that had watched empires rise and fall. "I'll stay," he said, "for now. For however long now turns out to be." And when Aldrich kissed him, a cold press of lips that somehow kindled fire, Marcus felt, for the first time in his 28 years, that he had finally been delivered to exactly where he was meant to be. 6 months passed like water through open fingers. Marcus had moved into the manor fully now, his sparse apartment surrendered without ceremony, his delivery routes assigned to some other night owl who would never know what lurked in the shadows of the estates they served. His room was on the east wing, where morning light fell gentle and filtered, and more nights than not, he did not sleep in it alone. Aldrich was not what the stories promised. He was not seduction and danger, not dark glamour wrapped in velvet threats. He was ancient loneliness, learning to be held. He was a king who had forgotten how to be touched, remembering one careful gesture at a time. He was a father who watched his son play chess with the mortal who had become family. And sometimes Marcus caught him with tears of blood sliding silently down his pale cheeks. Sebastian flourished. The tension had bled out of him slowly, replaced by something that looked almost like the childhood he should have had 70 years ago. He laughed now, actually laughed, not the careful performance of laughter he had learned to mimic. He asked Marcus endless questions about the mortal world, about food and daylight and the strange rituals of high school and university that he would never experience. He sat with his head on Marcus's shoulder during long evenings by the fire, no longer afraid to show need. The household shifted around them, making room for new dynamics, new alliances. The jazz musician from New Orleans taught Marcus to play piano, remarking that it was the first time in decades he'd had a student with warm hands. Constance, ancient and terrifying, began leaving books outside Marcus's door, histories she thought he should know, philosophies she thought might interest him, and once, inexplicably, a well-worn copy of Goodnight Moon, with a note that said simply, "You remind me of someone." Marcus did not ask who. Some griefs were too old to name. He thought about the turning. How could he not? It was there in every extended hand, every gentle kiss, every moment when Aldrich looked at him with that terrible mixture of love and anticipation of loss. The door was open, and they all knew it. He could walk through whenever he chose, but he did not choose, not yet. "Why?" Sebastian asked him one evening, with the bluntness of children who have not learned to hedge their questions. "Because I want to be sure," Marcus said. "Because immortality should be a choice made in clarity, not in fear of losing something good. But you might die before you decide." "I might?" Marcus ruffled the boy's dark hair, earning an indignant hiss that was mostly theatrical. "But that's true for everyone, isn't it? Mortal or not. Every choice we make closes off other choices. Every path we walk means other paths we'll never take. The only difference is the scale. That's very philosophical for a delivery driver. Former delivery driver, and I've had good teachers." Sebastian smiled, a real smile, young and bright despite everything, and Marcus felt his heart crack open a little more, making room for another piece of this strange family he had stumbled into. The anniversary came without fanfare, marked only by Aldrich placing a small wrapped package in Marcus's hands as the clock struck midnight. 1 year, Aldrich said, since the river. Marcus opened the package. Inside was a key, old, iron, heavy with significance. To the manor? To everything. Aldrich's hands covered Marcus's, cold around warm. The gates and the crypts and the sealed rooms, where we keep the things too precious to risk. All of it. Yours to access, yours to protect. He paused, and his ancient eyes held something fragile. Yours to inherit if you choose, when I am gone. You're not going anywhere. No, but neither, I think, are you. Aldrich leaned in, pressed his forehead to Marcus's. Thank you, Marcus Chen, for saving my son, for staying to save the rest of us. You saved yourselves. You just reminded us why we should want to. Aldrich pulled back, and there was a smile on his face, rare and real and beautiful in its ruin. That is no small thing. That is perhaps everything. Later, when the household had retired to their various shadows and the fire had burned to embers, Marcus walked alone to the river gate. He stood on the bank where he had first seen Sebastian, where he had first chosen to jump. The water rushed past, dark and swift, unchanged by the year that had transformed everything else. Running water, the thing that could unmake even the eternal, the boundary that the ancient dead could not cross. Marcus had crossed it, had plunged into its depths and emerged carrying something precious. Had done, without knowing what he was doing, the one thing vampires could not do for themselves. He thought about barriers, about the lines between mortal and immortal, between alone and together, between the world he had known and the world he had found. He thought about Sebastian's mother, who had chosen to age while her son stayed frozen. He thought about Aldrich, counting heartbeats for 800 years. He thought about the key in his pocket, heavy with promise. The moon rose over the trees, full and silver, casting light across the water. Somewhere in the manor, Sebastian was sleeping the strange sleep of his kind, dreaming whatever dreams immortal children dream. Somewhere, Aldrich was watching the sky, waiting for Marcus to return, counting the minutes with the patience of centuries. Marcus turned away from the river and walked back toward the light. The story did not end there. Stories like this do not truly end at all. They simply find a place where they can pause, where the narrator can step away and let the characters continue on their own. What can be said is this: Marcus Chen stayed. He stayed through Sebastian's slow journey towards something like peace, through the seasons that wheeled past the manor's ancient walls, through the nights when Aldrich's old griefs rose like ghosts and needed witnessing. He stayed through visits from other vampires, some curious and some hostile, all eventually convinced that the mortal in their midst was not prey but partner. He stayed through the gradual accumulation of years that began to show in the silver at his temples, in the lines around his eyes, in the stiffness that crept into his joints on cold mornings. He stayed and stayed and stayed, until staying became home, until home became meaning, until meaning became enough. Whether he ever walked through that door, the one that stood always open, the one that led to eternity, is not for this narrator to say. Some choices are too intimate for storytelling, too sacred for anything but the silence between heartbeats. What can be said is that the manor on the river's edge continued to stand, year after year, century after century. That lights burned in its windows more often now, warmth reaching toward the darkness. That a boy who was not quite a boy learned to play in the gardens without fear, and an ancient king learned to love without counting the cost. And a mortal who had always felt like a ghost in the daylight world finally found a darkness he could call his own. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled in from the marshlands and the river ran swift and cold beneath the stars, those who passed along the old roads might glimpse a figure at the water's edge, standing where a delivery driver once stood, watching the current that had started everything. Some say he was waiting, others say he was remembering. Perhaps he was simply being what he had always been, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of thresholds, a man who had jumped into dark water to save a drowning prince, and found himself delivered into a kingdom he never knew existed. The river rushed on, eternal and indifferent. But in the manor behind him, the lights burned bright, and Marcus Chen, deliverer of wine and rescuer of princes, smiled into the dark.